A few years ago, a parishioner gave me a book entitled How to Speak Southern, a linguistic guide for Yankees and other foreigners. The book explains how to pronounce English with an accent that is appropriate for south of the Mason-Dixon line. Although I've lived in Virginia since 1990, I still feel like a foreigner when it comes to the Southern accent. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been trying to fit in for years. I've learned how to say y'all. And I've learned that in Richmond, you don't say house, you say house, and you don't say out, you say out. One native once said to me, "Father, do you want to know if someone is really from Richmond? Well, if your mother and your sister spent the summer at the river, then you're from Richmond." Richmonders don't just love language, they love history as well. Consequently, Richmonders are very attentive to a person's family background. They want to know who your relatives were. In Richmond, your genealogy is an important part of any social introduction. I was once at a wedding reception where an elderly Richmond lady was introduced to a younger woman who was a native of Charlottesville. After the initial introductions, the elderly lady asked the younger one, "Now tell me, who are your people?" The older woman was convinced that if she knew the young woman's family tree, she would know all she needed to know about this young person she had just met. So she asked, "Now tell me, who are your people?" Although the Gospel of Matthew is not written south of the Mason-Dixon line, this Gospel still speaks with a unique accent. Today we hear the very beginning of Matthew's Gospel, and Matthew begins in a rather unusual way. Remember, these are the very first sentences Matthew uses as he introduces us to Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Matthew begins his Gospel with a genealogy. It's as if Matthew begins his Gospel by answering the question, "Now, Jesus, who are your people?" As in contemporary Richmond, the people of Matthew's time were convinced that you could tell a lot about someone if you knew their family tree. Given that, you might think that Matthew would want to give us a family tree of Jesus that's full of faith-filled folks, heroes of Israel's past. And Matthew does, in fact, tell us that Jesus' family tree starts with Abraham, and Abraham was a righteous man. So was Isaac, so was Jacob. King David is mentioned, and David was a great king. But most of the other kings of Israel who are mentioned were inept. In fact, many of these kings were completely unfaithful to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their ineptitude led Israel into exile. Who were Jesus' people? Many of them were inept, unfaithful kings. Who else is in the family tree of Jesus? Well, if you looked up some of the names that Matthew gives us in this genealogy, you would find that some of them are never mentioned in the Old Testament. In other words, we know nothing about these people. Who else is in the family tree of Jesus? Well, did you notice that in a genealogy laden with masculine names, Matthew interrupts the flow several times by mentioning a woman? This is highly unusual. All four of the Old Testament women who are mentioned by Matthew were considered foreigners in one way or another. They did not fully belong. Additionally, they all experienced what we might call an unusual sexual situation which brought them under a cloud of suspicion. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, commits adultery with King David. Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah, and Tamar dresses up like a prostitute and sleeps with her father-in-law in order to raise up children for her deceased husband. In her case, this questionable pregnancy was actually the way that God was working out his purpose, just as God is working out his purpose in the questionable pregnancy of the Virgin Mary, who finds herself to be pregnant before she started to live with Joseph. What an odd way to introduce the Savior of the world. If the lady from Richmond were around at the time of Matthew, she probably would have been shocked to find out who Jesus' people are. If you ask Matthew, now Matthew, who were Jesus' people? The answer Matthew gives is this: Jesus' people, his family tree, consists of mostly inept kings, sinners, of folks we know very little about, and some foreigners and women who come under a cloud of suspicion, but who turn out to be God's instruments. Who were his people? Adulterers, in one case a murderer, in every case folks who knew the messiness of the human condition. Why in the world would Matthew start out his gospel with such a messy family tree for Jesus? I think Matthew's doing this because Matthew is telling us that every sinner is part of Jesus' family. The Lord did not wait until he found a completely perfect family and then decide to come to earth. The Lord chose this messy, inept, sinful family tree that ran from Abraham through David to Mary and Joseph, and he said, there, right there, I'm going to take flesh there, in the company of sinners, in the middle of the mess. Jesus is very patient with sinners. He's comfortable with imperfect folks. After all, his family tree is full of them. We often make a serious spiritual mistake this time of year. We think that we have to get our whole spiritual house in order, that we have to make things perfect, and then Christ will come into our lives. But that's wrong. The genealogy in Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus is already in our lives. And where is he? He's right in the middle of your mess. Where should you look for him? Right in the middle of the messiest part of your life, the most imperfect part of your existence, that aspect of your life that seems most out of control. Where does Christ want to reveal his incarnate presence to you this Christmas? Not in those parts of your life that you think are perfect, but rather smack in the middle of whatever seems out of control. Look for Jesus there. You might be surprised to find that he has been there for a very long time already, offering peace and hope and help. The Lord takes flesh in imperfect settings. So open your eyes. The Lord is at the hospital, where illness ravages bodies. The Lord is in Afghanistan and Iraq, where war rends the lives of people. He's in the chaos and confusion of homes that are filled with tension due to anger or addiction or poverty. He's in the middle of your rat race. He's in your unhealed past. He's in your confusing future. He's with you right now, today, in whatever seems beyond your power to fix. Who are your people, Jesus? We are. Every one of us. Every one of our imperfect family members, neighbors, and even our enemies too. And so we ask, dear Jesus, teach us to recognize your presence in them and help us to find the gift of your presence in ourselves, where we need your peace and your promise the most.